Thank you for being here. Please comment the letter Y, so I know you are ready, and sit back to listen as I tell you the whole story. The cheerful voice of the Wells Fargo representative cut through my Tuesday morning like a serrated knife. I was walking down the busy streets of downtown Seattle, holding a cheap cup of drip coffee, minding my own business. When she said the words home equity line of credit approval, my feet stopped moving. The rushing crowd of commuters blurred around me. I asked her to repeat herself. She did, her tone still bright and professional, confirming that a $180,000 line of credit was now active. I told her firmly that I never applied for a HELOC. I heard the rapid clicking of her keyboard through the earpiece. She paused. Then she informed me that my parents, listed as co-signers on my property deed, had initiated the application 2 weeks ago. The first withdrawal, taking the absolute maximum limit of $180,000, had been processed at 9:47 a.m. the previous day. The paper coffee cup slipped from my fingers. It hit the concrete, brown liquid splashing over my shoes, but I didn't even care. I stood frozen, watching the steam rise in the bitter February air. My parents, my house, my equity. I asked the representative what address they had given for contact. More clicking. She read out the address for the Grand Ballroom at the Fairmont Olympic Hotel. I didn't hang up. I just started running. The hotel was only 4 blocks away from my office building. I knew exactly why they were there. It was the venue walkthrough for my older brother Elijah's wedding. It was a wedding I had been systematically excluded from planning for 8 months. Constantly told by my mother that my job as a public health compliance officer kept me too busy to contribute meaningfully. My mother had casually mentioned the wedding would cost around $200,000, laughing lightly as if that was pocket change. I burst through the heavy lobby doors of the Fairmont. The concierge directed me to the ballroom. My shoes squeaked loudly against the polished marble floors as I sprinted down the corridor. The heavy double doors to the ballroom were propped open. Inside, under the glittering light of massive crystal chandeliers, stood my mother. She was casually examining expensive silk fabric swatches with a high-end wedding planner. My father sat at a velvet-draped table covered in vendor contracts, actively signing checks. Elijah hovered right beside him, looking incredibly pleased with himself. They all looked up when I stormed in. My mother's face instantly lit up with a brilliant, artificial smile. She walked toward me, arms outstretched. She asked if I had taken time off work to surprise them. My voice came out completely flat, devoid of any emotion. I asked them directly if they took out a loan against my house. My father didn't even look guilty. He calmly set down his expensive silver pen. He looked me in the eye and stated that they had borrowed against their investment. He said Elijah's wedding required their investment. I took a step closer, my hands trembling with a mixture of pure rage and disbelief. I told them I paid the down payment. I pay the mortgage every single month. I reminded them it was my name on the paperwork. My mother's tone shifted instantly. She took on that patient, condescending quality I had heard my entire life. She hugged me briefly, pulling back to look at my face. She said family weddings are expensive. She smiled and told me I would understand someday when I had something worth celebrating. I turned around and walked out. I pulled out my phone. I called my lawyer immediately. Sitting in my car in the hotel parking garage, my hands shook so violently I could barely grip the steering wheel. The air inside the cabin felt suffocating. To understand the sheer audacity of what had just happened in that ballroom, you have to understand the dynamic I grew up with. You have to understand Elijah, the undeniable golden child, and me, the invisible bank account. My mind violently dragged me back 7 years. I was 22 years old, living in a miserable, drafty studio apartment near my university. The heater was broken for 3 months straight during the worst winter on record. I was eating cheap instant ramen and boiled eggs for dinner almost every night, working 2 part-time jobs just to keep the lights on and pay for my textbooks. I never complained. I thought I was doing the right thing, building character, being independent. One freezing Tuesday evening, Elijah pulled up to my apartment building. I heard the engine before I saw the car. It was a Porsche. Not a brand new one, but a sleek, aggressively loud used Porsche. He stepped out wearing a designer leather jacket, tossing the keys in the air with a smug grin. He told me our parents had helped him out with a little graduation present. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. I went inside and checked my bank accounts. For years, I had a joint savings account with my parents, a remnant from my teenage years that they insisted we keep open to help me manage my money. It was where I deposited all my summer job earnings, money I had designated as my college fund. I logged in and saw a withdrawal of $8,000. The account was nearly empty. I immediately called my father. My voice was tight, barely holding back tears of frustration. I asked him where my money went. My father didn't even hesitate. His voice was casual, completely dismissive. He said they needed to withdraw it to help Elijah secure reliable transportation for his new job in the city. I was stunned. I reminded him that Elijah's new job was 3 blocks from a major transit hub. I reminded him that I was walking 2 miles in the snow to get to my campus job. My mother got on the phone. She used that same patient, explaining to a child tone. She told me I was young and resilient. She said I could take the bus, but Elijah needed to make a good impression at his firm. She said he couldn't show up to client meetings in a rusted sedan. She told me I needed to stop being so selfish and think about the family's image. The worst part wasn't even the theft of my college fund. The worst part was that Elijah quit that prestigious job exactly 3 weeks later because his manager asked him to come in on a Saturday. He kept the Porsche, of course. I spent the rest of my senior year working a 3rd job, entirely giving up sleep, just to graduate without crushing student debt. I never saw a single dime of that $8,000 again. When I brought it up months later, my father looked at me with genuine confusion. He said I owed them for raising me, for putting a roof over my head for 18 years. He called it a minor contribution to the family. That was the day I realized my hard work would only ever be viewed as a resource to fund Elijah's lifestyle. But instead of cutting ties then, I just worked harder. I wanted to prove I didn't need them. I wanted to be undeniable. The memory of the Porsche faded, only to be replaced by an even darker realization. By the time I was 24, I had managed to secure a decent entry-level salary at the county health department. I was finally breathing a little easier. I had moved into a slightly better apartment, one with actual heating, and I was aggressively saving every spare penny I earned. I had a strict budget. I tracked every dollar. Then came the phone call about the emergency. My father called me late on a Sunday night, his voice sounding uncharacteristically frantic. He claimed they were going through a severe rough patch. He said the roof on their house was leaking, they had unexpected medical bills, and they were completely strapped for cash. He begged me to co-sign a high-limit credit card with them. He promised, swearing on his life, that it was strictly for absolute emergencies and that they would pay off the balance in full every single month. I hesitated. I knew their track record, but they were my parents. They had raised me. The guilt they weaponized was a heavy, suffocating blanket. I eventually agreed, believing that surely they wouldn't compromise my financial future when I was just getting started. I went to the bank, signed the paperwork, and handed them the card. For the first 2 months, nothing happened. I checked the balance religiously, and it remained at 0. I relaxed. Then, in the 3rd month, I logged in to check the statement. My heart completely stopped. The balance was $12,200. They had maxed it out. I frantically pulled up the itemized statement. It wasn't a roof repair. It wasn't a medical bill. It was a luxury vacation to Cabo San Lucas for their anniversary, complete with first-class flights and a stay at a 5-star resort. There were charges for high-end restaurants, spa treatments, and boutique shopping. I called them immediately, screaming into the phone. My mother answered from her beachside cabana, the sound of crashing waves in the background. I demanded to know what they had done. She didn't apologize. She just sighed, sounding annoyed that I was interrupting her vacation. She said they had been under a lot of stress and needed to unwind. She told me not to worry, that they would make the minimum payments until they got back on their feet. Minimum payments. The interest rate was astronomical. If they only made the minimum payments, it would take decades to clear the debt, and the interest would cost thousands. More importantly, this massive debt utilization ratio was destroying my credit score. In my line of work, dealing with financial compliance and public funds, bad credit could actually jeopardize my salary and my security clearance. I couldn't risk it. Couldn't sleep. I lived in a state of constant, gnawing anxiety. I knew they would never pay it off. They would just let it sit there, a ticking time bomb attached to my name. So, I did the only thing I could do to protect myself. I emptied my meager savings account. I took the money I had been saving for a reliable car and transferred it all to the credit card company. I paid off the entire $12,200 balance in one devastating click. When I told my father what I had done, hoping for at least a shred of gratitude, he just laughed. He said, "See? I told you your credit would recover. You're young. You make a good salary. You can afford to help your parents." I closed the account the next day. I swore I would never mix finances with them again. But I didn't know they were already playing a much longer game. The worst memory of all hit me as I sat in the parking garage. It was the memory of my proudest moment being twisted into a weapon. 3 years ago, at age 26, I achieved the impossible. I bought a house. It was a small, modest craftsman home in the Ballard neighborhood, purchased for $340,000. I put down a massive 20% down payment. That money didn't come from a trust fund. It came from 6 years of relentless, grinding sacrifice. It came from skipping every vacation, driving a beat-up car with a failing transmission, and working overtime whenever it was offered. When the day finally came to sign the closing documents, I was overwhelmed with emotion. I had done it. I had built a foundation for myself entirely on my own. Despite everything that had happened in the past, the stolen college fund, the maxed-out credit card, I still craved their approval. I wanted my parents to witness the biggest achievement of my life. I invited them to the title company office for the closing appointment. I wanted them to see that I was successful, that I was responsible. They arrived smiling. My mother brought a cheap bottle of champagne. My father patted my back, telling me how proud he was. We sat in a sleek glass conference room with the escrow officer. There were dozens of documents to sign. It was a mountain of legal jargon, fine print, and rapid-fire instructions. About halfway through the process, the escrow officer asked if I needed a quick break. My mother immediately chimed in, suggesting I go get us all some coffees from the lobby cafe to celebrate. She practically pushed me out of the room, handing me a $20 bill. I was so exhausted and excited that I didn't think twice. I left the room for maybe 10 minutes. When I came back with the coffees, my parents were sitting calmly, chatting with the officer. We resumed the signing. The officer slid papers across the table, pointing to where I needed to sign. He said my parents needed to sign as witnesses on a few specific county documents. I trusted the process. More importantly, God help me, I trusted my parents in that specific moment. I didn't read every single word of the remaining pages. I just signed where the yellow sticky notes told me to sign. I walked out of that office holding the keys to my own home. I thought I was a homeowner. I thought I was completely independent. I didn't realize until today, sitting in my car with my life falling apart, what had actually happened during those 10 minutes I was getting coffee. They hadn't signed as witnesses. They had instructed the escrow officer to amend the deed. They used my temporary absence to manipulate the paperwork, ensuring their names were added as legal co-owners of the property. They had smiled at me, drank the coffee I brought them, and watched me pour my entire life savings into an asset they now legally controlled. They didn't contribute a single dollar to the down payment. They never paid a cent toward the monthly mortgage, the property taxes, or the maintenance. But on paper, the county recognized them as having equal rights to my home. They had laid a trap, and they had waited 3 agonizingly long years for the equity to build up. They watched me pay down the principal month after month, just waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And Elijah's wedding was the perfect moment. I snapped out of the memory. The digital clock on my car dashboard read 10:51 a.m. I gripped my phone and dialed the number for Rebecca Morrison. the real estate attorney who had supposedly protected my interests during the house closing 3 years ago. The phone rang 3 times before she picked up. I didn't bother with pleasantries. I told her exactly what happened. I told her Wells Fargo had just approved a $180,000 HELOC against my property, initiated and withdrawn by my parents. There was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line. When Rebecca finally spoke, her voice was sharp, defensive, and utterly devoid of empathy. She asked me if I had reviewed the final documents before I left the office that day. I felt sick. I told her I trusted them. I told her they said they were just signing as witnesses while I was out of the room getting coffee. Rebecca sighed loudly. The rustling of paper echoed through the phone. She coldly explained that during the title appointment, my parents had requested to be added as co-owners to the deed. She said they presented it as a standard family arrangement. I practically screamed into the phone. I asked her why she didn't stop them. I asked her why she, as my lawyer, didn't pull me aside and explicitly warn me that my parents were hijacking my property. Her response made my blood run cold. She said, "Mason, you're Asian. In my experience, families from your background often pool resources and share property. Your parents told the escrow officer it was a joint family investment. Since you were paying my lawyer fees, I assumed you were aware of the family dynamics. You signed the final pages. Legally, you consented." Couldn't breathe. She had assumed. She had relied on a lazy, racist stereotype instead of doing her job and protecting her actual client. Because of her negligence, my parents were legally co-owners. Rebecca's voice turned strictly business. She explained that with co-ownership, any party on the deed can legally apply for a HELOC. She said the bank doesn't need all owners to consent if the applying owners meet the credit requirements. She told me I could try to challenge this in court, but it would be a massive, expensive, and incredibly slow civil litigation process. I asked her the only question that mattered right now. I asked what would happen if I couldn't make the new monthly payment. My existing mortgage was already tight. The new HELOC added over $1,200 a month to my debt. She didn't sugarcoat it. She said if the payments weren't made, the bank would foreclose. Or worse, my parents could legally petition the court to force a sale of the property to liquidate the asset, and they would be legally entitled to a portion of the proceeds. She hung up shortly after, offering a hollow apology. I sat in my car, staring blankly at the concrete wall of the parking garage. My parents had stolen my equity. My lawyer had let them do it. The bank had approved it. I was completely alone, staring down a barrel of financial ruin. All so Elijah could have an extravagant party. The urge to break down and cry was overwhelming, but I forced it back. Crying wouldn't save my house. I needed a plan. I needed a weapon. I didn't go back to work. I drove straight home, locked the front door, and marched into my home office. I sat down at my desk, the blue light of my monitor illuminating the dark room. If I was going to fight a legal battle against my own blood, I needed ammunition. I didn't need emotions. I needed cold, hard data. I opened a blank Excel spreadsheet. I titled it, Financial Exploitation. Then I started digging. I logged into every bank account I had ever owned. I pulled up 15 years of statements. I combed through thousands of old emails, Venmo transaction histories, and archived text messages. I was going to document every single dollar they had ever extracted from me. The numbers started adding up with horrifying speed. There was the $8,000 for Elijah's Porsche, the $12,000 for the credit card they maxed out in Cabo. But it went deeper. It was 1,000 tiny cuts. I found a transfer for $15,000 from 4 years ago. My father had called me weeping, saying they needed the money for an emergency funeral for a distant relative overseas. I sent the money immediately. 2 weeks later, I saw photos on Facebook of my parents and Elijah on a luxury cruise in the Caribbean. When I confronted them, my father casually claimed the relative had left a small inheritance, and they used it to grieve properly. They never paid me back. I found the property tax bill I paid for them last year, $4,800, because my father claimed his check got lost in the mail and they were facing penalties. I found the deposits for Elijah's last 3 apartments, $6,000 total, because he kept getting evicted for non-payment and my mother cried, begging me to help my brother. I documented every $200 grocery run, every $500 utility bill, every car repair I funded. I typed out the dates, the amounts, and the manipulative excuses they used in the adjacent column. Family obligation. You owe us. Elijah is struggling. My fingers flew across the keyboard. The anger I felt in the hotel was gone, replaced by a hyper-focused, chilling clarity. I was a compliance officer. I looked at spreadsheets for a living, hunting for anomalies, fraud, and misallocation of funds. For the first time, I applied my professional skills to my own life. I adjusted the amounts for inflation and opportunity cost. If I had invested that money instead of handing it over to them, what would it be worth today? The final number at the bottom of the spreadsheet made my chest tighten. $147,000 in direct financial exploitation. Adjusted for interest, it was closer to $178,000. They hadn't just stolen the equity in my house. They had been systematically draining my life force, my security, and my future for my entire adult life. They treated me like an ATM, while treating Elijah like a king. The spreadsheet wasn't just a list of numbers. It was a psychological profile of parasitic abuse. I printed the document. It was 12 pages long. I stacked the pages neatly on my desk, alongside the printed bank statements and screenshots of their text messages. I had the evidence, but I was just a county employee. I didn't know how to navigate the criminal justice system. I needed someone with actual power. I picked up my phone and dialed a number I hadn't called in 8 months. It was pouring rain by the time I pulled out of my driveway at 6:30 p.m. The Seattle sky was a bruised, heavy gray. I was driving toward Georgetown, a neighborhood in the southern part of the city. I was going to see Suda Park. 8 months ago, I was doing routine permit inspections for restaurant health code compliance. I walked into Suda's small, family-owned Thai restaurant. She was facing severe ventilation violations. The commercial exhaust system was ancient and failing. The violations were legitimate, and the county was ready to force her to close her doors immediately. Suda was devastated. She told me she couldn't afford the massive repair bill, and closing the restaurant would bankrupt her family. Most compliance officers would just write the ticket and walk away. But I saw how hard she worked. I saw the desperation in her eyes. Instead of shutting her down, I spent 3 weeks off the clock helping her navigate the county's convoluted Small Business Compliance Assistance Program. I helped her fill out mountains of paperwork, found her an obscure municipal grant for structural upgrades, and legally extended her correction deadline by 4 months while the repairs were completed. I saved her business. What I didn't know at the time, until she invited me to dinner to say thank you, was that her husband was James Park. King County Superior Court Judge James Park. I pulled up to the restaurant. The neon open sign was dark. It was Monday, their one day off. I parked my car, grabbed the thick manila folder containing my spreadsheet and the evidence, and ran through the rain to the back door. I knocked hard. Suda opened the door. The warm smell of basil, garlic, and chili oil wafted out, a stark contrast to the freezing rain. She looked surprised to see me, standing there soaking wet, clutching a folder like my life depended on it. I didn't waste time. I didn't cry. I spoke in a low, measured voice. I told her I was in trouble. I told her my parents had committed fraud, stolen my house equity, and I was going to lose everything. Suda didn't ask a single question. She didn't offer empty platitudes. She took one look at my face, grabbed my arm, and pulled me out of the cold alley and into the warm kitchen. She locked the heavy metal door behind me. She walked me out to the main dining room. The chairs were stacked on the tables. Only one light was on over a corner booth. Sitting in that booth, nursing a cup of green tea and reading a massive legal brief, was Judge James Park. He looked up over his reading glasses. Suda spoke to him rapidly in Korean. He set his papers down and looked at me. His expression was unreadable, completely neutral. Suda gently took my wet jacket and pointed to the seat across from her husband. "Sit down, Mason," Judge Park said, his voice deep and resonant. "My wife tells me you need help. You helped us when the system was ready to crush this place. Show me what you have." I unclasped the manila folder. I spread the 12-page spreadsheet, the bank statements, the fake inheritance texts, and the HELOC approval notice across the polished wooden table. I laid my life bare in front of a superior court judge. Judge Park didn't say a word for 40 minutes. The only sounds in the empty restaurant were the relentless drumming of rain against the front windows and the steady rustle of paper as he turned page after page. Suda brought over a pot of hot tea, pouring me a cup in silence. I sat rigidly in the booth, watching his eyes scan the documentation of my family's betrayal. I watched his jaw tighten when he read the text messages about the fake emergency funeral. I saw him trace his finger over the $180,000 withdrawal from Wells Fargo. When he finally reached the end of the spreadsheet, he carefully stacked the papers back together. He took off his reading glasses and looked me dead in the eye. "Mason," he began, his voice carrying the full weight of his authority. "What you have documented here is not family drama. It is a textbook, systematic pattern of financial exploitation, emotional manipulation, and coercive control." He tapped his index finger sharply against the HELOC document. "This, however, elevates the situation entirely. The HELOC itself, because your parents are legally on the deed, is technically a legal financial instrument. However, the method by which they obtained it is not." He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "You stated you did not apply for this loan. Did you sign the application documents? Did you authorize a credit pull? Did you appear before a notary?" I shook my head vigorously. "No, nothing. I found out when the bank called to congratulate me." Judge Park nodded slowly. "Then your parents forged your signature on a federal lending document. That is a felony. That is fraud under the revised Code of Washington, Section 9A.60.020. They have crossed the line from being terrible parents to being criminals." A cold shiver ran down my spine. The word criminals hung in the air. He pulled out a heavy legal notepad and a pen. "I cannot represent you. I cannot get involved directly due to my position on the bench. It is a conflict of interest. But I am going to tell you exactly how to dismantle them. You are going to wage a multi-front war, and you are going to be ruthless." He started writing rapidly. "First, you must establish a criminal record of the event. Tomorrow morning, you will go to the police precinct and file an identity theft and forgery report. Second, you will file a dispute with the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau regarding the bank's failure to verify your identity. Third, you will hire a forensic accountant to formalize the spreadsheet. Finally, you will retain a civil litigator to file for a quiet title action to rip their names off your deed, along with a lawsuit for full restitution." He ripped the page off the notepad and slid it across the table to me. "They are going to scream. They are going to tell everyone you are destroying the family over money. They will try to guilt you into dropping it." I looked at the piece of paper. It was a roadmap to destruction. "They already destroyed my future to pay for Elijah's party," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I don't care what happens to them anymore." Judge Park leaned back, a grim look of approval on his face. "Good, because if you follow these steps, Mason, they are looking at severe legal consequences. Prepare yourself for the fallout." I folded the paper and put it in my pocket. The war had officially started. Before I could go to the police, I needed to try and stop the bleeding. At 9 a.m. sharp the next morning, I walked into the main branch of Wells Fargo in downtown Seattle. I didn't go to a teller. I demanded to speak to the branch manager. I was ushered into a glass-walled office. Sitting behind a massive mahogany desk was Derek, a man in his late 40s wearing a suit that cost more than my first car. He looked at me with mild annoyance, like I was a bug that had flown into his pristine environment. I laid the HELOC approval notice on his desk. I kept my voice perfectly level. I told him my identity had been compromised. I told him my parents had forged my signature on the application and I needed the account frozen immediately, and any remaining funds blocked from transfer. Derek barely glanced at the paper. He leaned back in his leather chair, steepling his fingers. He gave me a patronizing smile. "Mr. Chin, I see here that Arthur and Eleanor Chin are co-owners of the property. Under bank policy, any co-owner can initiate a line of credit against the equity. We verified their identities." "You didn't verify mine," I snapped, leaning over the desk. "My signature is forged on the application. I did not consent to this debt." Derek sighed, looking at his watch. "Sir, we see this all the time. Families get into disputes. We deal with messy divorce proceedings where spouses try to freeze accounts out of spite. We deal with siblings fighting over properties. Bank policy dictates that unless you have a formal court order or an active police report detailing felony fraud, we cannot restrict access to a legally established joint account. Your parents are authorized users." He was stonewalling me. He didn't care that a crime had been committed. He only cared about the bank's liability guidelines. Just then, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out. It was a text message from Elijah. It was a photo of him standing in front of a mirror in a high-end tailor shop, wearing a custom-fitted tuxedo. The text read, "Suit fits perfect. Mom just paid the final deposit for the catering. This wedding is going to be epic. You better not wear your cheap work suit to my big day." I stared at the screen. My blood pressure spiked so hard my vision blurred at the edges. They were spending my house equity right at this exact second. They were laughing at me. I looked back at Derek. The smug, dismissive look on his face mirrored Elijah's. The system was designed to protect the thieves, not the victims. "I understand your position, Derek," I said, my voice dropping an octave. "You need a police report. You need proof of a felony." I grabbed the HELOC notice off his desk. "I'll be back," I said, turning toward the door. "Have a nice day, sir," Derek said, already turning his attention back to his computer monitor. I walked out of the bank, the cold Seattle air hitting my face. I didn't feel helpless anymore. I felt dangerous. They thought they had backed me into a corner. They thought because I was quiet and responsible I would just take the hit, complain a little, and eventually pay the bill to keep the peace. They had no idea who they were dealing with. I pulled out my keys, got in my car, and drove straight to the North Precinct of the Seattle Police Department. The North Precinct was loud, chaotic, and smelled faintly of stale coffee and industrial cleaner. I sat on a hard plastic chair in the waiting area for over 2 hours. I watched officers drag in suspects, lawyers argue in hushed tones, and desperate people pacing the floor. I heard a detective 2 desks over aggressively handling a messy custody dispute over the phone, threatening to send uniforms if the father didn't return the child. It was a grim waiting room of human misery. Finally, my name was called. I was directed to the desk of Detective Sarah Alonquo. She looked exhausted, surrounded by towering stacks of file folders. She offered me a seat without looking up, typing furiously on her keyboard. "What can I do for you today, Mr. Chin?" she asked, her voice flat. I placed my manila folder on her desk. I didn't start with the emotional backstory. I started with the facts. "I am here to report felony identity theft and forgery under RCW 9A.60.020. My parents forged my signature on federal lending documents to extract $180,000 in equity from my home." That got her attention. She stopped typing. She looked at me, then looked at the thick folder. She opened it and started reading the summary sheet I had prepared. As she read, I walked her through the timeline. I explained the co-ownership trap. I explained the bank's refusal to freeze the account without a police report. I showed her the HELOC application I had finally managed to get a digital copy of. I pointed to the signature line. "That is not my signature," I stated firmly. "They signed it. They initiated the transfer." Detective Alonquo pulled out a magnifying glass from her drawer and examined the printed copy. "It's a decent forgery," she muttered, "but we'll need a formal handwriting analysis from the state crime lab to prove it conclusively in court. That takes time. Weeks, sometimes months." "I don't have months," I said, my voice tight. "They are spending the money right now. My brother's wedding is in exactly 6 weeks. They have already paid out tens of thousands of dollars to vendors. If I can't stop this, the bank will foreclose on my house." She looked at me, her expression softening just a fraction. She saw the desperation, but she also saw the meticulous documentation I had provided. She saw the spreadsheet of the 15-year history of exploitation. "They stole 180 grand for a party?" she asked, almost to herself. "Yes," I replied. She closed the folder. She leaned back in her chair and stared at the ceiling for a long moment. A standard forgery case between family members usually gets kicked to civil court. Prosecutors hate them. "It's too much," he said. She said, My heart sank. Was I going to hit another wall? "But," she continued, sitting up straight, $180,000 crosses a significant threshold, and it involves a federally insured banking institution. That elevates it. She picked up her desk phone. "I'm going to file the official report so you can give it to the bank. But I'm also going to make a phone call. I know someone who hates bank fraud more than I do." She dialed a number. The game was about to change. Detective Alanquo told me to grab a coffee and wait. 30 minutes later, she walked me out of the precinct, and we drove in her unmarked car to the federal building in downtown Seattle. We went through intense security, riding the elevator up to the FBI field office. The atmosphere here was completely different from the precinct. It was quiet, intense, and aggressively professional. We were led into a small, windowless interview room. A few minutes later, Special Agent Marcus Chin walked in. He immediately clarified we were no relation. He was a specialist in white-collar financial crimes. He didn't offer me coffee. He sat down, opened my file, and read it with terrifying speed. When he finished, he folded his hands on the table and looked at me with cold, calculating eyes. "Detective Alanquo gave me the summary," Agent Chin said. "Your parents forged a signature on a loan application. That's a federal offense. But what interests me more is the destination of the funds." He flipped to the bank statement showing the $180,000 withdrawal. "They took this money in a lump sum. They are currently dispersing it to wedding vendors. Did your parents report this $180,000 as a gift on their taxes?" I blinked, caught off guard. I don't know. They just did it yesterday." Agent Chin leaned forward. "The annual gift tax exclusion is $17,000. Anything above that requires the filing of IRS Form 709. If they treat this money as theirs to spend on your brother, and they fail to declare it, they are committing tax evasion. Furthermore, if they are moving these funds electronically between accounts to hide the origin, that is wire fraud." I felt the air leave my lungs. I came here to stop a HELOC. Agent Chin was talking about federal indictments. "Can you really investigate them for that?" I asked, my voice shaky. "Mr. Chin," the agent said smoothly, "we work on joint task forces with the IRS Criminal Investigation Division every day. If your parents can suddenly afford a $200,000 wedding, and they resorted to forging documents to fund it, my professional instinct tells me they have other financial skeletons in their closet." He looked at my spreadsheet, running his finger down the list of extracted funds over the years. "This shows a pattern. A long-term pattern of off-the-books transactions. I am going to initiate a formal inquiry. I will refer the forgery to the Secret Service, as they handle fraud against financial institutions. I will hand the tax implications to the IRS." He stood up, towering over the table. "I need you to understand something. Once I press this button, you cannot unpress it. You cannot change your mind in 2 weeks because your mother cries and begs for forgiveness. This will likely end in federal charges, massive fines, and potentially prison time for your parents." I thought about the years of eating ramen. I thought about the crushing anxiety of the credit card debt. I thought about the smug look on Elijah's face in his custom tuxedo, paid for with the walls of my home. I looked up at Agent Chin. I didn't feel fear. I felt the absolute certainty of a man who had nothing left to lose. What they didn't know, what no one in my family knew yet, was that I had recently received a massive promotion at work. I was no longer just an inspector. I was now a senior compliance auditor. I knew exactly how to track fraud. Press the button, I told him. The fallout didn't happen slowly. It hit my family like a freight train running at full speed. It was March 28th, exactly 2 weeks before Elijah's $200,000 wedding was supposed to take place. The caterers were booked, the custom floral arrangements were ordered, and the Fairmont Olympic Hotel ballroom was locked in. My parents thought they had gotten away with it. They thought the bank manager had shut me down, and they assumed I had simply crawled back into my hole to accept my fate and pay their massive debt. They were dead wrong. At 6 a.m. sharp, while the upscale suburban neighborhood was completely silent, a fleet of dark, unmarked SUVs rolled onto my parents' pristine driveway. Neighbors later told me it looked like a scene straight out of an action movie. Over a dozen federal agents wearing windbreakers with bold yellow letters, FBI on some, IRSCI on others, swarmed the front porch. They didn't knock politely. They pounded on the heavy oak door with absolute authority. My father opened the door in his silk pajamas, expecting the morning paper. Instead, he was greeted by federal warrants shoved directly into his chest. Agent Marcus Chin led the raid. He and his team systematically dismantled my parents' illusion of wealth and security. They spent 4 hours tearing the house apart. They seized my father's desktop computer, his hidden external hard drives, and boxes of physical financial ledgers he kept locked in a basement safe. They confiscated my mother's phone and her tablet. Every single device that had a connection to their bank accounts or my forged HELOC application was bagged and tagged as federal evidence. The absolute best part happened around 8 a.m. Elijah, who still lived at home rent-free at 32 years old, stumbled out of the front door in his expensive designer bathrobe. He started screaming at the agents, demanding to know what they were doing, acting like the untouchable golden child he had always been. Agent Chin didn't even flinch. He just signaled a heavy-duty tow truck that was idling at the end of the street. The truck backed up into the driveway, right up to Elijah's beloved, aggressively loud Porsche. The very same car my parents had bought using my stolen college fund 10 years ago. Because the IRS suspected my father's cash business was a front for tax evasion, and because the Porsche was purchased with commingled funds, it was seized as a highly depreciating asset linked to financial crimes. Elijah completely lost his mind. He ran down the driveway barefoot, physically trying to block the tow truck driver. 2 heavily armed federal agents immediately stepped in, effortlessly grabbing Elijah by the arms and moving him onto the wet grass. They told him if he interfered with a federal seizure, he would be arrested for obstruction of justice on the spot. Elijah stood there, shivering in his bathrobe, completely humiliated in front of Mrs. Gable from next door and Mr. Henderson from across the street. The entire neighborhood watched as the symbol of his unearned arrogance was strapped down and towed away. His inheritance, his pride, his golden child status, all being dragged down the street by the federal government. And I wasn't even there to watch it. I didn't need to be. The panic in my mother's voice when she finally got access to a phone told me everything I needed to know. My phone rang at 4:15 p.m. that same afternoon. I was sitting at my desk at the county office, calmly reviewing a health code violation file. The caller ID showed my mother's cell phone number. The agents must have released it back to her or she borrowed a phone. I let it ring 3 times. Then, I hit accept and put her on speakerphone, setting the phone down on my desk. I didn't say hello. I just listened. "You monster!" my mother shrieked. Her voice was completely raw, stripped of all that fake, patient condescension she usually used on me. "You did this. You called the FBI on your own parents. They took everything. They took your father's computers. They took Elijah's car. You destroyed my financial security for a party." She was hyperventilating, completely unhinged. "Elijah's wedding is in 2 weeks. The venue just called. The bank froze the vendor accounts. The caterer canceled. The florist canceled. Everything is canceled. Do you understand what you have done? You tore this family apart over a house." I waited until she literally ran out of breath. I sat back in my office chair, looking out the window at the Seattle skyline. I felt absolutely nothing for her. No guilt. No sadness. Just the cold, hard satisfaction of a closed audit. I didn't tear the family apart, Mom, I said, my voice dangerously quiet and completely steady. You did that the moment you forged my signature on federal lending documents to steal $180,000 from my property. We borrowed against our investment, she screamed back, repeating the exact same lie she used in the hotel ballroom. It was our right. You could have just paid the monthly bill. You didn't have to call the police like a sociopath. You still don't get it? I interrupted, cutting her off sharply. You think I just walked into a police station and cried to a beat cop? You think this is just about a forged signature? Silence fell on the other end of the line. She heard the shift in my tone. Let me tell you why the FBI and the IRS showed up at your door simultaneously, I continued, speaking clearly and deliberately. You and Dad have treated me like an idiot my entire life. You thought I was just a boring, low-level county inspector pushing paper. What you didn't bother to ask me about recently, because you were too busy planning Elijah's party, is my career. I leaned closer to the phone. I got a promotion 3 months ago, Mom. I am now a senior compliance auditor for King County. My entire job, my specific professional expertise, is tracking down financial fraud, investigating the misallocation of public funds, and building airtight, undeniable paper trails for prosecution. I heard a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. When I found out what you did, I said, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper, I didn't just file a police report. I audited my own family. I spent hours building a forensic financial dossier. I mapped out the stolen college fund, the credit card fraud from Cabo, the fake funeral money, and the unreported cash drops from Dad's business. I organized 15 years of your financial exploitation into a format so legally perfect that the IRS Criminal Investigation Division couldn't ignore it if they tried. My mother didn't say a single word. The silence was absolute. I used my salary, my skills, and my brain to end you, I stated flatly. I handed the federal government the exact map they needed to destroy your entire life. You underestimated me, and now you are going to pay for it. Don't ever call this number again. I pressed the end call button. I picked up my pen and went back to my paperwork. I had never felt more powerful in my entire life. The shockwaves from the federal raid destroyed Elijah's life before the sun even went down. My father tried calling me an hour after I hung up on my mother. He didn't yell. His voice was incredibly small, shaking with a pathetic kind of terror I had never heard from him before. He tried to bargain. He said family doesn't send family to prison. He promised they would pay me back every single dime, that they would sign whatever I wanted, if I just called Agent Chin and told him it was all a big misunderstanding. I laughed a cold, humorless laugh. I told him he committed federal bank fraud and tax evasion. I told him I couldn't call off the federal government even if I wanted to, which I absolutely did not. I told him he should save his breath for his defense attorney, and I hung up. But the real collapse happened that evening. It involved Chloe, Elijah's fiancée. Chloe came from a very wealthy, highly respectable family in Bellevue. Her parents were doctors. She was polished, kind, and completely oblivious to the toxic, parasitic reality of my family. She thought my parents were successful business owners and that Elijah was a rising star in corporate consulting. She had no idea his entire life was subsidized by my stolen equity, until the caterer called her. Since the HELOC funds were frozen by Wells Fargo, the massive electronic transfers my mother had made to the wedding vendors were suddenly halted and flagged for federal fraud review. The high-end caterer panicked and called the secondary contact on the contract, Chloe. They demanded their $40,000 final payment, stating that Eleanor Chin's accounts were frozen due to a federal criminal investigation. Chloe drove straight to my parents' house. From what I heard later from the Secret Service agent who was interviewing neighbors, it was a spectacular confrontation. Chloe walked into the house, which was still in shambles from the FBI raid, and demanded the truth. Elijah, cornered and terrified, tried to lie. He tried to say it was a banking error, a misunderstanding with my house. But my mother, completely broken and panicking, blurted out the truth. She admitted they used my house to get the money for the wedding, but she framed it as me being selfish and trying to ruin their special day by calling the cops. Chloe wasn't stupid. She put the pieces together. She realized her dream wedding was being funded by a felony crime committed against her future brother-in-law. She realized Elijah was a 32-year-old man who allowed his parents to steal $180,000 from his younger brother just so he could have an ice sculpture and a custom tuxedo. She looked at Elijah with pure, unadulterated disgust. She didn't yell. She just calmly took off the 3-carat diamond engagement ring, a ring I later found out my parents had bought using the HELOC money, and threw it directly at his chest. The ring bounced off his shirt and rolled under the living room sofa. She told him the wedding was entirely off. She told him she never wanted to see him or his criminal family ever again. She walked out the door and drove away. Elijah called me at midnight. He was blackout drunk, sobbing and screaming into the phone. He called me a jealous, spiteful loser. He blamed me for ruining his life. He blamed me for Chloe leaving him. He screamed that I was supposed to protect the family, that I was supposed to take the hit so he could be happy. I let him scream. When he finally stopped to take a breath, I said exactly 5 words to him. "Have a nice life, Elijah." Then, I blocked his number forever. This is the moment that changes everything, the moment I finally took back control of my life. Thank you so much for your patience and for staying with me until now. You've been amazing. Please give this video a like and comment 1 below to let me know you've made it this far. Not only does this help more people find this story, but it also lets me know that my experiences truly mean something to someone. Your support is my greatest motivation to keep sharing the rest of this journey. The weeks that followed were a masterclass in aggressive legal warfare. With the threat of federal prison breathing down their necks, my parents' arrogance completely evaporated. They hired a frantic criminal defense attorney who quickly realized they had absolutely no leverage. The evidence I provided, combined with the bank's logs and the forged signatures, made their case indefensible. My civil lawyer, Judge Park's trusted recommendation, moved in for the kill. We didn't wait for the criminal trial to conclude to secure my assets. We cornered them with a civil settlement they couldn't refuse. We dragged them into a stark, gray conference room at a downtown law firm. My parents looked like they had aged 10 years in 2 weeks. My father's expensive suit hung loosely on his frame. My mother wouldn't even look me in the eye. They looked like they were fighting for custody of their last dime. My lawyer placed a stack of documents on the table. The first was a quitclaim deed. By signing it, they officially and permanently surrendered any and all legal ownership claims to my property. They were stripping their names off my house forever. The second document was a legally binding restitution agreement. I didn't just want the HELOC money back. The bank had already frozen the account and clawed back $127,000 directly from the wedding vendors. I wanted the 15 years of financial exploitation returned. I wanted the money for the Porsche. I wanted the credit card money. I wanted the fake funeral money. The agreement stipulated that they owed me exactly $147,000. They were required to pay me $1,470 every single month for the next 10 years. And to ensure they didn't default, my lawyer placed a legal lien on their house as collateral. If they missed a single payment, I had the legal right to force the sale of their property to collect my debt. My father's hands shook violently as he picked up the pen. He looked at me, a pathetic plea in his eyes. "Mason, please. This is going to bankrupt us. We'll lose everything." I stared back at him with absolute indifference. "You forged my name to steal my house," I said smoothly. "Sign the papers, Arthur, or we take this to trial and I let a jury decide." He swallowed hard, lowered his head, and signed. My mother signed right after him, a single tear running down her cheek. It wasn't a tear of regret for what she did to me. It was a tear of self-pity because she had finally been caught. I took the documents, stood up, and walked out of the room without looking back. My house was finally completely mine. You would think the legal destruction of their finances would be enough to make the rest of the family back off. You would be wrong. Toxic families have flying monkeys, and mine was my Aunt Linda, my mother's younger sister. Aunt Linda called me 3 days after the settlement was signed. She was furious. She started screaming the second I answered the phone, calling me a ruthless, ungrateful sociopath. She accused me of destroying the family name, bringing shame to our relatives, and pushing my parents to the brink of suicide. She demanded that I call the federal prosecutor and beg them to drop the tax evasion charges. What Aunt Linda didn't know was that I automatically recorded calls from unknown or hostile numbers. I let her rant for 3 solid minutes, detailing exactly how I was ruining the family hierarchy. When she finished, I spoke in a calm, professional tone. Aunt Linda, I just want to inform you that this call is being recorded. Under federal law, contacting the victim of an active federal criminal investigation and attempting to coerce them into dropping charges or altering their testimony is a felony known as witness tampering. If you contact me again, I will forward this audio file directly to Special Agent Chin at the FBI. Do we understand each other? She gasped, muttered a terrified curse word, and slammed the phone down. I never heard from her again. But my mother had one last desperate, chaotic move to play. A week later, she actually showed up at my workplace. I was walking through the expansive glass lobby of the County Health Department building when I heard a familiar, shrill voice echoing off the marble floors. My mother was standing near the security desk, crying hysterically and screaming my name. She was trying to publicly shame me. She yelled to the security guards and the passing county employees that I was a terrible son, a betrayer, and a liar who sent his own family to jail over a simple misunderstanding. I froze, feeling a sudden spike of anxiety. This was my professional environment. But before I could even step forward to handle it, a deep voice boomed across the lobby. It was Mr. Henderson, my boss, the director of the compliance division. He walked briskly out of the elevators, flanked by 2 large security guards. He had read the news. He knew exactly what was happening in my personal life because I had preemptively disclosed the federal investigation to HR to protect my security clearance. "Ma'am," Mr. Henderson said, his voice echoing with absolute authority, "you are trespassing in a secure county facility. You are harassing a senior official. You have exactly 10 seconds to exit those glass doors, or I am having you arrested for public disturbance and trespassing." My mother looked at him, stunned. She looked at me, hoping I would intervene and save her. I just stood there, my arms crossed, watching her. The security guards stepped toward her, placing their hands near their radios. Her face crumbled. The public performance had failed. She turned around and practically ran out the doors, humiliated in front of dozens of my colleagues. That afternoon, I didn't go back to my desk. I went straight to the county courthouse. I filed for an immediate restraining order against my mother, my father, and Elijah. The judge granted it without hesitation, citing the ongoing criminal case and the workplace harassment. The boundary wasn't just mental anymore. It was enforced by law. The poison was completely cut off. Fast forward 6 months. The dust had finally settled, and the landscape of my life looked completely different. The federal case against my parents concluded not with a dramatic trial, but with a quiet, devastating plea deal. Their defense attorney advised them that fighting the IRS was financial suicide. They pleaded guilty to felony tax evasion and bank fraud. Because they had no prior criminal records and agreed to cooperate fully with the IRS auditing process, they narrowly avoided federal prison time. Instead, they were sentenced to 3 years of intense, highly restrictive federal probation. But the financial penalty was absolute ruin. The IRS audit revealed that my father had been running his side business completely off the books for 7 straight years, hiding hundreds of thousands of dollars. The back taxes, combined with the massive federal fraud penalties, totaled over $340,000. They couldn't pay it. The government didn't care. To satisfy the IRS debt, and to keep up with the monthly restitution payments they now owed me, they were forced to liquidate their assets. They had to sell their massive, beautifully decorated suburban house, the house I grew up in, the house they used as a status symbol to look down on me. They sold it at a heavy loss just to move the money quickly. They packed up their expensive furniture and moved into a cramped, run-down, two-bedroom rental apartment in a highly undesirable neighborhood in Renton. And then there was Elijah. The golden child had lost his shine. After Chloe left him and canceled the wedding, his life unraveled. His high-end consulting firm found out about the federal raid. News travels fast in corporate circles, and they quietly let him go, citing restructuring. Without his parents' stolen money to fund his lifestyle, he couldn't afford his luxury downtown apartment. At 32 years old, Elijah packed his designer clothes into garbage bags and moved into the tiny second bedroom of our parents' new, miserable apartment. Through the grapevine of distant relatives, I heard the daily reality of their lives. The three of them were trapped in that small space, completely broke, blaming each other for their downfall. Elijah blamed our parents for getting caught. Our parents blamed Elijah for demanding such an expensive wedding. They lived in a constant state of screaming matches and bitter resentment. The perfect family image they had spent decades cultivating was entirely reduced to ash. I didn't feel sorry for them. I didn't feel a desire to gloat, either. I just felt a profound, overwhelming sense of relief. They were exactly where they deserved to be, dealing with the consequences of their own extraordinary greed. Just when I thought I understood the entire scope of their betrayal, the universe threw one last, terrifying piece of the puzzle into my lap. It happened on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. I was grabbing a coffee at a small cafe near the courthouse when I bumped into my Uncle Robert, my father's estranged younger brother. Uncle Robert was the black sheep of my father's side of the family. He was a quiet, blue-collar mechanic who never bought into my parents' flashy lifestyle. He always treated me well, but he kept his distance from the family drama. He saw me, walked over, and asked if he could sit down. He looked tired, his hands stained with engine grease. He stirred his coffee slowly, avoiding my gaze for a long time. "Mason," he finally said, his voice low and raspy. "I heard what happened. The raid, the house, the wedding. I heard you took them down." I nodded slowly, unsure of where this was going. "I did what I had to do to protect my property, Uncle Robert." He looked up at me, his eyes filled with a grim, dark realization. "You don't know the half of it, kid. You think that $180,000 was just for Elijah's ice sculptures and champagne." I frowned. "That's what they said. That's where the vendor payments were going." Uncle Robert shook his head, leaning over the small table. "Your dad's cash business. It wasn't just failing. It was completely bankrupt. He got involved with some very bad, very dangerous people about 2 years ago to keep it afloat. Unlicensed lenders. Loan sharks." A cold chill ran down my spine, freezing the blood in my veins. "He owed them over $80,000 in pure high-interest debt," Robert continued, his voice barely a whisper. "They were threatening to break his legs. They were threatening to come to his house. Your father was terrified. The wedding was just a convenient, flashy cover story." I stared at him, my mind racing, snapping the puzzle pieces together. They were going to use half that HELOC money to pay for the wedding to keep up appearances for Chloe's wealthy family, Robert explained. And they were going to quietly funnel the other half to pay off the mob. They knew you couldn't afford the monthly payments on that HELOC. They knew the bank would eventually foreclose on your house. The absolute, horrific truth hit me like a physical blow to the chest. They weren't just stealing my equity for a party. They were actively sacrificing my entire financial future, my home, and my safety, to pay off my father's criminal debts. They were willing to let me go bankrupt and homeless just to save his skin, and they used Elijah's wedding as the perfect, emotional smokescreen to justify the theft. "They were going to drown you to save themselves," Uncle Robert said quietly. "You didn't just save your house, Mason. You saved your life. If you hadn't brought the feds down on them when you did, those loan sharks might have come looking for you next, since your name was tied to your dad's new cash flow." I sat back in my chair, the cafe noise fading into a dull buzz. The sheer scale of their ruthlessness was breathtaking. I thanked Uncle Robert, paid for his coffee, and walked out into the rain. I had spent years wondering if I had overreacted, if I had been too harsh by calling the FBI. Now I knew. I hadn't been harsh enough. The following Saturday morning, I woke up early. The Seattle sky was clear, a brilliant, crisp blue pushing away the gray clouds. I walked downstairs into my kitchen. My kitchen, in my house. The hardwood floors were cool beneath my feet. I turned on the espresso machine, listening to the comforting hum of the water heating up. While the coffee brewed, I walked over to the kitchen island. Sitting right in the center of the marble countertop was a thick, officially stamped envelope from the county records office. I had opened it the night before, but I just needed to see it again. I slid the heavy parchment paper out of the envelope. It was the new, officially recorded property deed. I traced my finger over the printed text. Under legal owner, there was only one name, Mason Chin. There were no co-signers. There were no hidden clauses. There were no parasitic family members lurking in the margins waiting to strike. The quit-claim deed had been processed. The title was clear. The house was entirely, unquestionably mine. I poured my coffee and walked over to the large bay window looking out over the small backyard I had maintained myself. I thought about the drafty studio apartment, the stolen college fund, the crushing credit card debt, and the terrifying confrontation in the bank manager's office. I thought about the years I spent twisting myself into knots trying to earn the love and respect of people who only saw me as a walking ATM. I took a sip of the hot coffee. Tasted incredible. For the first time in 29 years, I felt a sensation I had never truly experienced before. I felt completely safe. The constant, low-level hum of anxiety that had been the soundtrack of my life was gone. There was no more waiting for the other shoe to drop. There was no more dreading phone calls asking for emergency money. The fortress was secure, and I was the one who had locked the gates. I had survived the storm, and I had come out the other side stronger, sharper, and completely unbroken. The financial scars were healing. The restitution payments from my parents were hitting my bank account automatically every first of the month, and my career was thriving. I was truly, completely free. As I stood by the window, letting the morning sun warm my face, my phone buzzed on the counter. I walked over and picked it up. It was a text message from Suda Park. Dinner tonight at the restaurant? James is making his famous short ribs, and he wants to look over the blueprints for that kitchen renovation you were talking about. See you at 7 o'clock? I smiled, a genuine, relaxed smile that reached my eyes. Suda and Judge James Park had become a constant presence in my life over the last 6 months. They didn't just give me legal advice. They checked on me. They invited me over for holidays. They celebrated my promotion. They showed me what actual unconditional support looked like. I typed back immediately, "I'll bring the wine. See you at 7 o'clock. I set the phone down. Society constantly pushes this narrative that blood is thicker than water. We are taught to forgive everything, to endure endless abuse, and to set ourselves on fire just to keep our toxic relatives warm, all in the name of family. But sitting in my own kitchen, holding the deed to my own life, I realized that was a lie. Blood doesn't give anyone the right to destroy you. It doesn't give them a free pass to steal your future or manipulate your kindness. Some families you are born into, and sometimes those families are a curse you have to break. But the beautiful thing about life is that you don't have to stay tied to the anchor dragging you down. You can build your own family. You can surround yourself with people who respect your boundaries, who celebrate your victories, and who would never dream of forging your name to fund their fake lives. I looked around my quiet, peaceful home. I had fought a war to keep it, and I had won. I was no longer the invisible son or the reliable bank account. I was the architect of my own life. And the foundation was finally solid. Thank you for sticking around and listening to my story. It's been a long, difficult road, but speaking it out loud to all of you has been incredibly freeing. I hope this resonated with you in some way, especially if you have ever felt trapped by the guilt and expectations of the people who were supposed to protect you. Have you ever found yourself in a similar situation, dealing with toxic family members or financial betrayal? Tell me how you handled it down in the comments. I read every single one. If you have made it to the very end of this video, you are officially part of what I call the 1% Club. To prove you made it, Leave a comment with the letter W for winner. This is our secret code, a sign to recognize the resilient, amazing people who watch until the final second and understand the true value of walking away from toxicity to find your own peace. If my journey helped you, or if you just love a story where the underdog finally wins, please hit that like button and follow the channel. We have a lot more stories to share, and I'd love for you to be part of this community. Stay strong, protect your peace, and I will see you in the next one.